I chose not to invite my siblings to my wedding because none of them had ever invited me to theirs. I have 4 older siblings, all of whom are married, and not one of them thought to include me in their big day. Their excuse? Every single one of them chose to have a child-free ceremony. At first, I assumed I'd be an exception. After all, I wasn't just any kid, I was their brother. But that assumption didn't last long. The first to get married was my older sister, Isabella. She set the precedent with her no-kids rule, and, like a pack of sheep, the rest followed. When Isabella had her wedding, I was only 9. Even though I understood why I wasn't included, it still stung. She was marrying someone I actually liked, yet I wasn't allowed to be there to see it happen. 2 years later, my other sister, Camila, got married. Again, I was left out. I told myself it didn't matter because I wasn't a troublemaker, I was a well-behaved kid. But apparently, that didn't count for anything. Then, when my brother Adrian got married at a time when I was already 16, I thought things might be different. Originally, Adrian hadn't planned on a child-free wedding, but our family pressured him into it because it was easier. I asked if I could be an exception since I was 16, practically an adult compared to an actual child, but he shut that down immediately. According to him, making an exception for me wouldn't be fair to the other kids. Hearing that, I snapped. I told him it wasn't fair that I hadn't been allowed at a single one of my siblings' weddings, but instead of anyone understanding my frustration, my parents were furious. As punishment, they grounded me for 7 months. By the time my youngest sister, Valeria, got married when I was 17, I was numb to it. I already knew the answer before I even asked, so I didn't bother. And sure enough, I was left out again. At that point, it barely registered as an insult anymore. I just went about my life, ignored the whole thing, and sent her a quick congratulatory message. But when my parents found out, they were furious that I hadn't made a bigger effort to acknowledge her wedding. I didn't care. Instead of dealing with them, I locked myself in my room and spent all my time with my fiancée. So now, here I am, getting married, and I've made my decision. If my siblings didn't consider me important enough to invite to their weddings, then they have no business being at mine. The moment they realized they weren't invited, the family group chat lit up. Adrian was the first to speak, wondering if there had been a mix-up with the mail. Camila, on the other hand, skipped the pretense and outright demanded to know why she hadn't received an invitation. I saw the messages, read them carefully, and then did exactly what they had done to me for years. I ignored them. I wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of a quick answer. The next morning, my mom called. I barely had time to say hello before she launched into an angry interrogation, as if I'd done something truly awful. Her tone dripped with outrage as she demanded to know why I had excluded my siblings. I kept my voice calm, took a deep breath, and spelled it out for her. They didn't invite me to their weddings, so I figured it was only fair to return the favor. Silence. A long, heavy pause stretched between us as she tried to wrap her head around what I just said. Then, as expected, she lost it. She immediately jumped to blaming my fiancé, accusing them of somehow changing me. According to her, I used to be sweet, but now I was unrecognizable. I nearly laughed because this was classic mom. When faced with a reality she didn't like, she'd rather blame someone else than accept the truth. I shut that down quickly. I told her this wasn't about my fiancé, it wasn't about her, and it wasn't some petty grudge. It was about how, for years, my siblings had made it clear that I wasn't important enough to include in their biggest moments. So now, I saw no reason why they should be part of mine. She didn't have a response. Instead, she just hung up. Typical. But that was only the beginning. The next day, the guilt-tripping campaign escalated. Isabella sent a message drenched in fake sympathy, claiming that she never meant to hurt me, and that I should have moved on by now. Move on? Was she serious? These people had excluded me from every milestone in their lives, and now they expected me to pretend none of it had ever happened? I responded with the truth. This wasn't about getting over it, it was about fairness. If they hadn't considered me worthy of a place at their weddings, why on earth would they deserve a spot at mine? Her reply came quickly, and it was just as ridiculous as I expected. She accused me of being childish, called me a spoiled brat, and insisted that family should always come before resentment. Oh, now they wanted to play the family card? Where was that family loyalty when I was a kid, desperately hoping to be included? Then, things escalated further. My parents, in a dramatic, last-ditch effort, decided to stage an intervention. Without warning, they showed up at my house, convinced they could talk me into changing my mind. But the moment they started speaking, it was clear they weren't concerned about me. They were worried about appearances. My mom wasted no time making it about how this would look to others. What will people think of us, Lucas? What kind of person doesn't invite their own siblings to their wedding? She acted as if I had done something horrible, like I was the villain in this situation. I tried to explain, again, that this wasn't just about one event. This was years of being pushed aside, ignored, and treated like an afterthought. But before I could finish, my dad cut me off. His voice was sharp, dismissive. You're being childish. Selfish. And that's when my patience ran out. Childish and selfish? That was rich. I had been a literal child when I begged to be included in their weddings, only to be dismissed as dramatic. And now, as an adult, they all suddenly wanted to act like none of that had ever happened. I wasn't going to play along. I made myself clear, I wasn't changing my mind. They weren't coming to my wedding. And if they kept treating me like this, they wouldn't be the only ones left off the guest list. My parents included. The room fell into an eerie silence. My mother looked like she might collapse right there on the spot, while my father's face turned a deep, furious red. Neither of them said another word. Instead, they stormed out, slamming the door behind them. Over the next few weeks, the fallout was predictable. My parents called me spiteful, ungrateful, selfish. My siblings took turns trying to guilt-trip me, painting me as the villain who was ruining the family. Adrian, ever the emotional manipulator, tried a different angle. He told me my nieces had been looking forward to my wedding, and that leaving them out was just cruel. This time, I didn't even dignify him with a response. I was done. And then, finally, my wedding day arrived. For the first time in a long time, I felt nothing but relief. The ceremony was exactly how I had envisioned it, light, joyful, and filled with the kind of love that actually mattered. As I danced with my wife, I realized something. I was in control now. My life was mine, no longer dictated by people who had never truly valued me. Later, I learned that my mother had arranged a separate dinner for my siblings on the same day as my wedding. Some sort of pathetic silent protest. As if their absence was supposed to sting. As if it was supposed to ruin my day. I almost laughed when I heard about it. They could delude themselves all they wanted, but nothing would change the fact that, for the first time in my life, I had stood up for myself. And it was liberating. After the wedding, I thought that was it. That the battle was over. That life could finally move forward. Everything about that day had been perfect. The flowers, the music, the food, and most importantly, the people who had been there. I didn't miss anyone. I didn't feel a single ounce of regret. But, of course, peace never lasts in this family. A few days later, the passive-aggressive comments started rolling in. At first, it was subtle. A few indirect jabs in the family group chat. Adrian was the first to take a shot. We saw some pictures from your wedding. Those flowers looked basic. I ignored it, but irritation crept in. Then, as expected, Camila chimed in. And the venue? I don't know. It looked more like a casual get-together than an actual wedding. You could have asked us for help. Help? From the same people who had deliberately excluded me from their own weddings? The audacity was almost impressive. That's when I realized how they'd seen the pictures. I had blocked every single one of them from my social media, yet somehow, they had still managed to get access. Turns out, they had gone through mutual friends, fishing for any glimpse of a wedding they weren't invited to. And now, instead of moving on, they were picking it apart, criticizing something they hadn't even experienced. I forced myself to stay silent. I wasn't going to give them what they wanted, a reaction. But then my mother called. She skipped any pretense of politeness and went straight for the attack. Lucas, what was that wedding? I saw the pictures, and honestly, I expected more from you. Everything looked so simple, nothing like your siblings' weddings. That suit? You deserved something more glamorous. And why wasn't it in a church? Your brother had a much grander ceremony. That wedding didn't seem worthy of our family. For a moment, I was stunned. Not because I agreed, but because of how unbelievably rude she was. The lack of shame, the sheer entitlement, it was staggering. I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to stay even. Mom, the only thing that wasn't worthy here was you. Silence. You weren't invited. You had no business even looking at those pictures, and yet here you are, critiquing something that had nothing to do with you. If you didn't like it, great. Because nothing about my wedding was planned for your approval. Her outrage came fast. You're being so selfish, Lucas. Do you really think you can just cut us out of your life? That's not normal. You've always been so resentful, and now you're punishing us. What did we ever do to deserve this? That was it. That was the final straw. What did you do? My voice was cold now. Let's take a trip down memory lane, Mom. Every time I wanted to be part of something important, I was ignored. Every single one of my siblings got married, and not once was I considered important enough to be there. And now, suddenly, I'm supposed to pretend that never happened? I'm supposed to welcome you all with open arms, like none of that ever mattered. I let out a sharp breath. You want to know what real hypocrisy is? The only thing that could have ruined my wedding was inviting any of you. And then, just like that, silence. For a moment, I thought she finally understood. That maybe, just maybe, something I said had gotten through to her. But I should have known better. She took a deep breath, and with pure contempt in her voice, she spat out the same tired accusations. You're ungrateful. We did everything for you, and this is how you repay us? You're throwing away your family for a woman who's barely been in your life. You'll regret this. I didn't even let her finish. I hung up. I was done wasting my breath on someone who would never admit their own mistakes. But, of course, the drama didn't stop there. If anything, that call only added fuel to the fire. My siblings, clearly emboldened by my mother, started flooding the family group chat with messages. Adrian went straight for the guilt trip. You've destroyed this family, Lucas. Congratulations on pushing away everyone who ever loved you. Camila, as expected, took the dramatic approach. I hope the woman you chose is worth it because you've lost everything for her. I read each message in silence, feeling the weight of their words, but refusing to let them pull me back in. My wife sat beside me, watching, knowing it stung but not wanting to interfere. After a few moments, I made my choice. I left the group chat without responding. It wasn't worth it. None of them were. The days that followed were filled with private messages, missed calls, and more desperate attempts to drag me back into their toxic cycle. I ignored every single one. Then, my mother escalated things. She showed up at my door unannounced, still convinced she could force me to bend. When I answered, I didn't let her inside. Mom, there's no point. You only know how to criticize and belittle me. I don't want that in my life anymore. She refused to back down, yelling through the doorway. Family is forever, Lucas. You can't just cut us out because you're hurt. I opened the door just enough to meet her eyes. My voice was steady, unwavering. Family should mean support, respect, and love, not manipulation, not guilt, and certainly not constant criticism. If that's all you have to offer, then yes, I can cut you out of my life. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. Then, I shut the door in her face. She kept yelling, but I wasn't listening anymore. I had made my decision, and for the first time in my life, I was truly free. Since that day, I've maintained complete silence. No calls, no texts, no forced reconciliations. The few times they tried to reach out, it was just more of the same accusations, guilt trips, bitterness. I didn't have the energy for it anymore. My life was no longer about them. It was about me, about my wife, about the love and respect we were building together, the kind of foundation I had never experienced in my own family. Looking back, I know that walking away was the best decision I ever made. I don't miss them. I don't feel guilty. My life is calmer, happier, and more fulfilling than I ever thought possible. Cutting them out wasn't just necessary, it was the only way I could truly breathe. And then, something incredible happened. We found out my wife was pregnant. The moment we saw the positive test, emotions flooded through me. Tears filled my eyes as my wife wrapped her arms around me, whispering, "We're going to raise this baby with so much love that they'll never feel like they're missing anything." That was it. That was the only thing that mattered. From the very start, we knew that our child would only be surrounded by people who genuinely cared. That meant my family had no place in their life. And yet, somehow, word still got out. Maybe it was a distant relative. Maybe an old family friend. It didn't matter. All that mattered was that, once again, my phone lit up with messages from people I wanted nothing to do with. The first was from my mother. "Lucas, I heard about the baby. I want you to know that despite everything, we're your family, and it's important for the baby to have their grandparents in their life." I didn't reply. My wife and I had already made our decision. This wasn't about being cruel. It was about protecting our child from the same toxicity I had endured my entire life. Then came the messages from my siblings. Adrian, ever the manipulator, tried to play this supportive card. "Congratulations on the baby, Lucas. Despite everything, we're still siblings. I know you'll need support, and we're here for you." Camila, of course, had no interest in pretending to be kind. "Hold on to your grudge if you want, but at least let us meet our niece or nephew. They deserve to know they have a big family." I read each message in silence. My wife was next to me, her fingers gently lacing through mine. She didn't even have to say anything. I already knew what she was thinking. I didn't know them anything. This was our moment. Our family. And only those who truly cared had a place in it. She was right. A week later, my mother showed up at our doorstep, unannounced as always. When I opened the door and saw her standing there, something in her face almost made my resolve waver. There was something that looked like regret in her eyes, but I knew better. My heart clenched for just a second before I forced myself to stay firm. I didn't even give her the chance to speak. Mom, don't. My voice was steady, unwavering. Stop insisting. You are not part of my life, and you will not be a part of my child's life either. Her face twisted in desperation. Lucas, you can't do this. We're your family. This baby is part of us, too. I shook my head. No, I said, my tone like steel. What I can't do is let my child grow up the way I did. I want them to be surrounded by real love, without manipulation, without criticism, without the emotional games you and the others always played. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I wasn't moved. I knew exactly what those tears meant. They weren't for me. They weren't for my child. They were for her, because for the first time, she wasn't getting her way. Before she could start another performance, I shut the door. It hurt, but it had to be done. Since then, the texts, the calls, the attempts to pull me back and haven't stopped. But they don't touch me anymore. My focus is on my wife, our growing family, and the life we're creating together. We're planning everything with so much love and care. Every moment of this journey feels sacred. Choosing names, setting up doctor's appointments, feeling the first kicks. Some people might call it selfish to keep my family away from the baby, but I call it protection. I refuse to let my child be another pawn in their endless cycle of manipulation. For the first time in my life, I am at peace with my decision. My child will be safe. They will be loved. And nothing else matters. With each passing month, we built a sanctuary around ourselves. Our home became a place of joy, of quiet anticipation. We painted the nursery together, carefully selecting each shade of color. We spent late nights assembling furniture, flipping through parenting books, imagining the life we were about to bring into the world. It was perfect, until my sister, Isabella, got our new address. One afternoon, a large package arrived at our doorstep. When I opened it, my breath caught in my throat. Inside was an expensive baby bassinet, pristine and carefully wrapped. A note sat on top, scrawled in her familiar handwriting. For my future niece or nephew. Family heirlooms should be passed down. Isabella. I stood there, staring at it, my hands trembling with something between anger and exhaustion. My wife appeared at my side, taking one look at the package before quietly helping me pack it back up. That same day, we donated it to a women's shelter. But Isabella's unwanted gift was just the beginning. Soon, more packages started showing up at our door. Camila sent designer baby clothes, each outfit more extravagant than the last. Adrian shipped a handmade rocking chair, accompanied by a note claiming he had spent months crafting it. Valeria mailed a stack of photo albums, pages covered in sticky notes, pointing out happy family memories I was supposed to cherish. Every gift was carefully designed to cut through my resolve, to force me to look back instead of forward. And it worked in small ways. I grew quieter, more distant, struggling with emotions I thought I had buried. My wife noticed. She always noticed. Then, one evening, after an especially difficult day, another box arrived. This time, from my mother. Inside, wrapped delicately in old tissue paper, were my baby clothes. My childhood blanket. Little pieces of a past she wanted me to hold on to. I sat there, staring at it, feeling the weight of years pressing down on me. That's when my wife knelt beside me, her hand resting gently on her growing belly. They're trying to buy their way back in, she said softly. But we don't owe them access to our child just because they're sending gifts. She was right. That night, we reached out to a lawyer. Together, we drafted a formal cease and desist letter. It felt extreme, but in the end, it was the only option left. The packages stopped, but my family wasn't done. Instead, they turned to another tactic, public shame. My siblings started a full-blown social media campaign. Old family photos began popping up on their accounts, each post drenched in fake sentimentality. Family is forever. Forgiveness is love. Rebuilding is possible. They tagged mutual friends, distant relatives, people they knew would see. It was never really about reaching me. It was about controlling the narrative, about making sure everyone knew that in their version of the story, they were the heartbroken victims, and I was the bitter, ungrateful son who had abandoned his family. But what they didn't realize was that I wasn't the same person anymore. Their words had no power here. Not anymore. Here's your rewritten version, polished for stronger emotional impact and a powerful sense of closure. Some distant relatives I barely knew started reaching out, urging me to do the right thing, as if they had any idea what that actually meant. But the final straw came during my wife's baby shower. We had planned it with care, surrounded by our chosen family, friends who had supported us unconditionally. It was supposed to be a day of pure joy, and for a while it was, until my mother and sisters arrived, uninvited, carrying gifts and wearing their best pitiful martyr expressions. I felt my wife tense beside me. I saw the way our friends shifted uncomfortably, sensing the brewing storm. Before they could make a scene, I met them at the door, blocking their way. "This is a private event," I said firmly. "You need to leave." My mother's face twisted in disbelief. "We're family," she protested, trying to push past me. "You can't keep us from celebrating our grandchild." I held my ground. My voice was steady, but my heart pounded. "This isn't your grandchild. You lost that privilege when you decided I was never important enough to be part of this family. If you don't leave, security will escort you out." Isabella, ever the manipulator, tried one last desperate attempt. "Lucas, please. We've all made mistakes. One day, when you're a parent, you'll understand how important family is." I exhaled slowly, letting the final weight of their words settle. Then, for the first time, I spoke with absolute clarity. "No. When I become a parent, I'll understand exactly how important it is to protect my child from toxic relationships. Even if they're family. Especially if they're family." The silence was deafening. They left, but not before making sure everyone heard their tearful protests. They wanted an audience. They wanted to be seen as the victims. But I didn't care. Later, my wife squeezed my hand and whispered, "You did the right thing." And I knew she was right. Our true friends rallied around us, sharing their own stories of family boundaries, reminding us we weren't alone. The months that followed were the most peaceful I'd ever known. We took birthing classes, prepared our home, and poured all our energy into the joy of becoming parents. My wife's pregnancy progressed beautifully, and every day, I watched her grow with our child, filled with more love than I had ever imagined. And when the time finally came, we were ready. The hospital staff had clear instructions. Only our real family was allowed in. No exceptions. Her parents, who had always treated us with respect and kindness, were there for us. And when our son was born on a crisp autumn morning, perfect and healthy, with 10 tiny fingers and 10 tiny toes, I knew we had done the right thing. As I held him for the first time, looking into his wide, curious eyes, I made a silent promise. He would never feel the sting of exclusion. He would never experience conditional love. He would never know what it felt like to beg for a place in his own family. Of course, the moment word got out, the messages started again. A flood of congratulations, thinly disguised guilt trips, attempts to worm their way back in. Adrian, as expected, was the worst of them all. "Your son will grow up ashamed of how you tore this family apart." I looked down at my newborn son, sleeping peacefully in my wife's arms. And for the first time, I felt nothing. No anger. No sadness. No guilt. Just certainty. He would grow up surrounded by people who actually cared. Not the performance of family. Not empty words. Not the fragile illusion my siblings had spent their whole lives trying to uphold. As the weeks passed, we settled into life as new parents. Every milestone felt like a quiet victory. His first smile, his first laugh, the first time he rolled over, each one celebrated by the people who had actually been there for us. Our friends, our neighbors, my wife's parents. The people who mattered. Then, when he was 3 months old, my mother made one final attempt. She showed up at our door, clutching a handmade blanket, her face streaked with tears. "Please, Lucas," she begged. "Let me hold my grandson. Just once." I looked at her. Really looked at her. And all I saw was the woman who had dismissed my pain for years. Who had chosen appearances over love. Who had never once apologized, never once taken accountability for the damage she had caused. I exhaled, my voice softer than I expected. "No, Mom." She blinked at me, confused. "You're not his grandmother. You're just the woman who taught me exactly what kind of parent I don't want to be." She stood frozen in place, waiting for me to change my mind. I didn't. She left the blanket on the doorstep. We donated it, just like all the others. And then, just like that, she was gone. Our son is 5 months old now, thriving in an environment of love, respect, and peace. He will never be the forgotten child, the afterthought, the one fighting for scraps of affection. Sometimes, people ask if I worry that he's missing out on extended family. I just smile. Our home is filled with photos of the people who actually love us. Friends who became family. My wife's parents, who show up with joy and respect. Neighbors who bring casseroles and kindness. He's not missing anything. Last week, an invitation arrived in the mail. Isabella's daughter is getting married. A peace offering. A final attempt at reconciliation. I stood at the counter, staring at it, lost in thought. My wife found me there, our son babbling happily in her arms. "What are you thinking?" she asked, watching me closely. I picked up the invitation, turned it over in my hands, then let it fall into the recycling bin. "I'm thinking about cycles," I said, reaching for our boy. "And how proud I am that we broke them." She smiled, understanding completely. Our son will grow up knowing that love isn't measured by blood or tradition. That family isn't built on obligation, it's built on choice. It's built on respect, on kindness, on actions rather than empty words. As I sit here now, watching him sleep peacefully in his crib, surrounded by drawings and photos of the people who love him unconditionally, I know we made the right choice. There are no family heirlooms in his room. No relics from a past weighed down by guilt and expectation. Instead, everything here was chosen with care, with joy, by people who have proven their love through respect and understanding. The journey hasn't been easy, but it's been worth it. And every time I look at my son's innocent face, I know we have finally broken the cycle. He will grow up free. Free from manipulation, from toxic love, to be exactly who he is. And that is the greatest gift I could ever give him.